Okay, welcome to the Kimberlite webinar for Intervention Services. My name is David Batt, President of Kimberlite Research, and I'm glad you're able to join us today. This is the fifth in the Kimberlite webinar series. Our past webinars have included a review of drilling services, including downhole mud motors, MWD, rotary steerables, drill bits, and drilling fluids. And we've also hosted detailed webinars on the competitive landscape and supplier performance for hydraulic fracturing services, artificial lift, production chemicals, and most recently, in late October, perforating services. Let me know if you or your colleagues need access to these webinars, and we can provide you the link. Just check out our website at kimberliteresearch.com, or simply drop us an email or a chat message today. Feel free to submit questions during today's presentation via the chat box, or you may also email us directly, and we'll address your questions during the presentation. For those of you that may not be familiar with Kimberlite Research, I will provide a brief background and then dive into the 2020 Intervention Services reports. Kimberlite Research each year personally interviews over the phone through phone interviews about 3,000 E&P operators and users globally. About 50% of our research is North America, and about 50% of our research is international. Some of you on the webinar with us today may have participated in one of our studies in the past, and for that, I say thank you. We will produce a series of reports each year documenting supplier performance and competitive position across G&G, geology and geophysics, and formation evaluation topics like logging while drilling, wireline logging, and surface logging, mud logging. These reports have just recently been updated. Directional drilling services, like we talked about from drill bits. We just updated cementing surfaces and surface wellheads, and we'll have future webinars regarding that as well. Today, we'll be talking about intervention services when a well is no longer performing as desired, and oil and gas operators go in with E-line, slick line, or coiled tubing and perform a variety of services. Today, we'll be focused on the intervention services market based on interviews with intervention workover managers, engineers, operation managers, completion drilling, and production engineers. In these reports, we'll be interviewing 259 users around the world from 160 different E&P oil companies and provide performance trends. One of the exhibits that we'll be using today is this value map or quadrant map, where we cross-plot supplier performance on the x-axis against pricing competitiveness on the y-axis. As an oil company, most of the oil companies for which we support, most of the oil companies are looking for suppliers that perform better than industry average and are plotted on the right-hand side of this x-axis. And they may be up here in the premium quadrant where they cost more but they're worth it, or they may be value advantaged. Many oil companies sometimes end up using suppliers that are discount providers that underperform the market but offset with attractive pricing. And sometimes that's acceptable, sometimes it's not. And almost in all cases, our oil company clients would prefer to avoid any suppliers in the top left-hand quadrant. So with that, let's dive in. During the months of October, November, and December of 2020, we interviewed the 259 users from around the world from 160 different oil companies. And we looked at who they were using for E-line, slick-line services, coiled tubing, tractors, and acid stimulation around the world. We get a mix of major oil companies, national oil companies, and large and small independent oil companies. One of the things that we looked at was the future activity for 2021 in terms of drilling. And this particular feedback is based on responses from over 500 respondents globally. But looking ahead into 2021, operators are forecasting in their reviews back to us at Kimberlite Research that we should anticipate about 9.6% more wells to be drilled in 2021 versus 2020. International lands projected to pick up in the second half of 2021 and end up about 5.6% more wells drilled in 2021 versus 2020. Gulf of Mexico follows at 4.1. Canada and international offshore appear to be flat. When we asked the open-ended, unaided question to the oil and gas operators around the world, What are the key challenges that you face in maintaining the productivity of your oil and gas wells? This is an open-ended question. They're free to mention all of the challenges that they face. What we find when we assess the responses from the oil and gas operators worldwide, we find that 47 to 49%, nearly 50% of all operators, cite challenges with deposit control, be it corrosion, wax, paraffin, scale. And what's interesting is most all oil companies are using production chemical treatments, but only 20 to 30% of the production chemical users amongst the oil and gas industry cite 100% satisfaction in the effectiveness of their production chemical treatment programs. The other 70% of users of production chemicals either provide neutral ratings or negative ratings in the effectiveness of their production chemical treatment. So certainly an opportunity there. We provide a very comprehensive report on production chemicals, so let us know if you want to take a deep dive on that. Other common challenges faced by the oil and gas operators globally are sand and debris and having to do a lot of wellbore cleanouts, casing and tubular failures, followed by artificial lift failures in land, and offshore, a lot of packer and valve issues. If we start to break out these downhole challenges by region, either like the Permian Basin or Eagle Ford, or the Rockies or Williston or Canada, or by the North Sea, Middle East, Asia Pacific, or West Africa, again, we see the preponderance of challenges dealing with deposit control, casing and tubular leaks, and sand. It's principally in the North America land market where we see artificial lift playing a larger role of the failures. Water breakthrough in the Middle East, commonly experienced. When we take a look at how the oil and gas operators go about contracting for their intervention services, what we find is about 71% of the oil and gas operators worldwide will contract with multiple suppliers for their services. They may contract with one supplier for the conveyance and a separate supplier for the tools. About 29% of the time, oil and gas operators really prefer to have one integrated single supplier that will handle the project management of the job, and that one single supplier will bring whatever necessary downhole tools and conveyance are required. When we look at the number at the top services that are used to when a well breaks and you have to call in the well doctor to come fix the well, the most common services that are used by the oil and gas operators worldwide are wellbore cleanout, setting and pulling packers, perforating services, production logging, cement pipe evaluation, fishing services, bottom hole pressure temperature surveys. 70 to 80% of the oil and gas operators that we interviewed for the Intervention Services series of reports that we published say that they use these services each and every year. When we look at a typical well that needs to be intervened, what we find is about 1/3 of the time, 30 to 34% of the time, perforating services are involved, cement pipe evaluation is involved, bottom hole pressure temperature surveys are involved, and wellbore cleanouts are involved. When we get to fishing services are only used on approximately 15% of the interventions performed globally. For each one of these services, most operators have a preference as to whether or not they prefer to use wireline or slickline, or coiled tubing as the preferred conveyance for wellbore cleanout and sand and debris, as well as with scale and paraffin removal. Sometimes operators prefer to use jointed pipe, be it a workover rig, a snubbing unit, or a drilling rig. And we track this by region. When you look regionally, what you find is in the offshore market, perforating services and cement pipe evaluations are involved in nearly half of the interventions that take place. Whereas on North America land, most interventions are involving wellbore cleanout, sand debris, cement pipe, and perforating services most commonly used. When we conduct our phone interviews with the oil and gas operators worldwide, one of the first questions that we'll ask them is sometimes technical questions, such as for slickline. What percent of your slickline work uses conventional slickline versus real-time digital slickline? And what percent of the interventions with E-line or slickline require the use of tractors? You can see only about 10% of the interventions using wireline, slickline require the use of downhole well tractors, and only about 15% of the slickline work is currently using digital. When we asked the oil and gas operators who do they use for slickline or E-line conveyance, a total of 86 different suppliers were mentioned globally. So this market is heavily fragmented with just many different suppliers globally. We're down from 102 suppliers mentioned in 2018 down to 86 suppliers. When you move to North America land, 57 different suppliers were cited as being used. When we asked the oil and gas operators to rate the performance on a scale of 1 to 10 of the suppliers with whom they're using for their E-line, slickline services, what we find is when we get their performance feedback on these 7 performance measures: responsiveness to needs, equipment quality, reliability, competency of field service personnel, technical support, availability, operational advantages like time and cost savings at the rig and non-productive time, and pricing competitiveness. What we see here in these performance ratings is that through the voice of the E&P operators globally, the top performing suppliers get average performance ratings around 9.0 on a 10-point scale, with 10 being excellent performance. And the very worst performing suppliers for E-line, slickline end up with average ratings around 7 or even below. And so from an oil and gas operator's perspective, when you have a market with 50, 60, 70, 80 different suppliers, and we see a very wide variance in the performance of the suppliers. Some suppliers are performing excellent, some are performing at the very lowest levels of performance in the market, and some are just in the middle. When we start to take a look, say, in North America land, what we find here is that the small to mid-tier suppliers, encapsulated here as all others, tend to get the highest performance ratings each and every year in responsiveness to needs, technical support, field service execution, equipment quality, reliability, and pricing competitiveness. The big 3 suppliers, Halliburton, Schlumberger, and Baker Hughes, are typically consistently getting the very worst performance ratings. If we go interactive with our software and we start to look at some of these small suppliers, be it 9 Energy, KLX, GR Energy, what you find here is a very big challenge for oil and gas operators. You can see that the wide scatter of performance for responsiveness to needs from the top performing suppliers all the way down to the bottom performing supplier, which is Halliburton. When you get to equipment quality and reliability, the performance ratings begin to tighten up. But when you get back over to competency of field service personnel, again, you get a big variance in performance as well as with technical support. This makes it very challenging for an oil and gas operator. And so what we try to do is we try to provide some guidance by illustrating overall supplier performance and competitive position on this value map or quadrant map that I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the webinar. We plot supplier performance on the x-axis. The midpoint of this x-axis is industry average performance. You can see companies, all these small to mid-tier companies, of which there's probably about 50 of them encapsulated in this all others. Renegade through Tubing, KLX, Allied are all getting customer review ratings that are either on par with industry average or better than industry average. Companies like Halliburton, Schlumberger, Pioneer, 9 Energy, Baker Hughes, even GR Energy are getting customer review ratings that are below industry average. When you look at their pricing competitiveness ratings, however, you'll also find that many of these operators are getting pricing competitiveness ratings that are on par with industry norm, which is the midpoint of this y-axis. As an oil and gas operator, you're typically trying to find an operator that's in this top right-hand quadrant that costs more but is worth it, or in the bottom right-hand quadrant where you find suppliers that are delivering differentiated value and performance. You're trying to avoid suppliers in this top left-hand quadrant. So you can see in the North America land market with 50, 60, 70 suppliers in the market, if you're an oil company and you've only used one supplier, for example, it makes it very difficult to understand how these other suppliers could potentially perform. With the gift of the feedback that we receive through the interviews from the oil and gas operators, we're able to capture and benchmark supplier performance. So feel free to reach out to us for any assistance that you may need to support your selection efforts for suppliers. When we move into the international land market, the market tightens up quite significantly. And what we find is that Schlumberger is clearly in this cost more but worth it quadrant, whereas Baker Hughes and Halliburton are kind of viewed as being an acceptable value and fall within this fair value fairway that runs diagonally from the northeast quadrant all the way down to the southwest quadrant. In the international land market, the small to mid-tier suppliers, unlike North America land, are actually viewed as performing below industry average. When you move to the offshore market, you find other specialty players like Expro and Altus differentiating themselves. Weatherford has a very small market share as well, but the few customers that use them have given them favorable reviews. And Schlumberger, again, is in the cost more but worth it quadrant. So if we go to tools, slickline and E-line tools, what we find, again, 80 different suppliers are being mentioned as used globally, so it's a heavily fragmented market. Only 43 suppliers were mentioned as being used in North America land, which is down from 63. So certainly we are seeing some consolidation of suppliers due to the market downturn. But again, we see wide variance in performance, and we see that not all suppliers are performing at the same level. If we move into the North America land market and look at the competitive landscape for tools, it's very similar to conveyance, where the small to mid-tier suppliers are outperforming the larger companies like Schlumberger and Halliburton. When you move internationally, again, you've got Schlumberger as the premium supplier, cost more but worth it. You have Expro as a value advantage supplier, along with Weatherford. When you move offshore, Schlumberger again is in the premium supplier. In the cost more but worth it, Halliburton is performing about on par with industry average performance, and it has attractive pricing competitiveness to help compete against their performance shortcomings versus the market leader, Schlumberger. If we combine all of these ratings together, again, you see that there's quite a bit of variance amongst conveyance and tools combined in North America land. Some suppliers are consistently getting customer review ratings, like Through Tubing, that are consistently better than industry average. Some have a little bit of variability in performance, like 9 Energy, how they declined from 17 to 18, and then it looks like they're showing some improvement in 2020 for 9 Energy Services. 9 Energy Services also rates very, very favorably in our submitting services report that was just published. When you move into more of the international market, you have fewer suppliers to choose from. And again, Schlumberger tends to be the leader internationally, and Schlumberger tends to be the leader in the offshore market. However, when you go to the North America land market, what we find is that the small and mid-tier suppliers tend to be the top performers. If you were to take a look at Halliburton for slickline E-line services, you'd see how competitively disadvantaged they are in North America land and how they compete better in the offshore. Schlumberger competes better in the international and offshore market, but is competitively not advantaged and is competitively vulnerable in the North America land. When you look at some of these smaller suppliers, such as Allied Horizontal, they consistently plot in the top right-hand quadrant for U.S. land as being a premium offering. GR Energy continues to be plotted out as either a value advantage supplier or a discount provider in the market for U.S. land. KLX Energy shows improvement from 18 to 20 and is currently viewed in both cases as delivering good value for the dollar. 9 Energy's performance declined from being value advantaged to being value disadvantaged from 18 to 2020. Pioneer Energy performance declined from 18 to 20. Renegade continues to be positioned as a value advantaged. We're not highlighting all of the 50 or 60 suppliers in today's webinar. Feel free to reach out to us if you need information on any of the other suppliers with whom you're considering or you've used in the past, and we'll be glad to assist you. When we move to coiled tubing, conveyance and tools, again, we find that about 14–15% of coiled tubing jobs use real-time. Tractors are used, though, only about 5% of the time for coiled tubing well intervention jobs. The market is heavily fragmented, but not as heavily fragmented as E-line slickline. We're down to 56 suppliers being used globally versus 86 for E-line slickline. So a pretty good reduction in the number of suppliers. Most of the North America land operators for coiled tubing conveyance will use one and a half different suppliers. Some operators will spread their business out over 2 coiled tubing suppliers. Some will use 1, but the industry average is 1.48. We do track market share for each of these, and I won't spend too much time on the webinar tracking market share because I'm really kind of focusing on the fact that there's such variance in the performance between the very worst performing coiled tubing conveyance suppliers and the very best performing coiled tubing conveyance suppliers. Just like I shared with you for E-line slickline, if I go to our interactive software for our coiled tubing, what we find is there's a wide variance between the top performing on responsiveness to needs in United States land and the worst performing, and there's a huge variance. It's like someone took spaghetti and just threw it up on the wall and said, figure it out. So being able to benchmark these suppliers year on year is very helpful in helping oil companies achieve best value. See how the performance ratings tighten up quite considerably for equipment quality and reliability, not as much variance there. Most of the variance in performance amongst these suppliers is with field service execution, trying to get competent trained folks in the field that can consistently perform from job to job, as well as with responsiveness to needs. Technical support also sees a wide variance in performance and delivery. Availability tends to tighten up quite a bit and has been improving, just obviously due to the oversupply and overcapacitization given current demand levels. When we go look at the competitive position in North America land for coiled tubing, all of a sudden you find that these small to mid-tier suppliers, encapsulated here as all others, are no longer viewed as providing differentiated performance off to the right of the x-axis, as we saw with E-line slickline. Rather, these small to mid-tier suppliers in aggregate overall are viewed as delivering industry average performance. Suppliers that are viewed as delivering a little bit better than industry average performance are Basic, CT Partners. CUD tends to rate consistently rather well, and Halliburton moved into the favorable zone for the first time after several years of being below industry average performance, and we track the industry average. International land, not much difference seen in performance, the only difference is seen in pricing, competitiveness. In the offshore market, Schlumberger is viewed as the premium supplier that costs more and is worth it. When we move to coiled tubing tools, again, it's fragmented with over 50 different suppliers. Again, we see variance in performance. And again, when we go to North America land, what we find in this case, the small to mid-tier suppliers encapsulated together as all others continues to shift further to the left and are now viewed as performing below industry average, where Through Tubing Solutions is viewed and has been viewed actually for the last several years in our research as the leading provider for coiled tubing tools in the North America land market. International land, we find that Weatherford and Baker Hughes are competitively advantaged in delivering the best value. And in the offshore market, we find that Schlumberger is really delivering the best overall performance, and they're positioned in the cost more but worth it quadrant. If we take a look at the coiled tubing tools and conveyance combined together, and we take a look at some of the major suppliers, let's go to some of the minor suppliers, the mid-tier suppliers. You can see CUD traditionally trying to provide some pricing leadership to the market and performing on par with industry norm. CT Partners always consistently viewed as delivering value advantaged performance and value. Through Tubing Solutions, consistently viewed as value advantaged. KLX Energy, I think they merged with Quintana Energy Services. Their performance is observed to have declined from 18 to 20 for coiled tubing services. But you may recall KLX Energy was viewed as delivering good value for slickline E-line. So again, this is another example where you may find that certain suppliers are good for certain services and not as good of a value for other services necessarily. But again, KLX Energy's pricing and performance profile are aligned, and they certainly fall within the fair value fairway It's just that as an operator, you need to determine if you need a value advantaged or a premium supplier, or if you can make do with a discount offering. When we move to acid stimulation, what we find is that there's a huge variance in performance between the best and the worst performing acid stimulation suppliers. Again, it looks like someone threw spaghetti at the wall and you're trying to figure it out. What we find is in North America land, there's a company called Petroplex that, along with CUD, but Petroplex is a relatively new supplier to us at Kimberlite that we picked up in our research, that rates exceedingly well based on the customer reviews from the oil and gas operators that we interview. So this is very encouraging to know that you have many, many different suppliers to choose from in North America land for acid stimulation jobs that are all viewed as delivering strong value. There are exceptions, of course. Basic, Halliburton, Baker Hughes, and Schlumberger all plot unfavorably in terms of customer review ratings. Internationally, the market tightens up in performance, with Schlumberger being the high price leader and the small to mid-tier suppliers being the value advantage discount providers. In the offshore market, Schlumberger is starting to position themselves as the premium supplier. If we look at CUD, you can see they rate well for energy acid stimulation services, and I think they maybe had one for Petroplex we talked about. It rates exceedingly well, and basic energy not so well. And you see here, downhole tractors. Not very many people use downhole tractors. Like we talked about, they are used on about 10% of well interventions. And you can see that in large measure, it's really driven by WellTech and Schlumberger. Baker Hughes has also been starting to compete, and in the offshore market, Baker Hughes is viewed very favorably. What type of benchmarking information would help in the area of operations? What metrics you use? Okay, I thought that was a question that was coming in. What I'd like to maybe do is to kind of share with you something that could be of interest. I know many of you may be operating in the Permian Basin or in U.S. land. And the point that we're trying to make here, let me see if I was able to pull that up successfully. I was not. Let's try that one more time. If you take a look at the supplier's performance in the Permian Basin, for example, or take a look at Halliburton real quick, you can see that if you, lost my graph there, or just look at it this way. If you look at Halliburton in the Permian Basin, you can see that Baroid for drilling fluids and hydraulic fracturing, they're viewed as delivering exceptional value, along with some of the other chemicals and other offerings. But some of the offerings with Sperry and wire and pump down perforating, they're not viewed as delivering very good value. Okay. Oftentimes in North America land, what you may find is that the small to mid-tier suppliers in the Permian Basin, which comprise approximately 65% market share of the Permian Basin, tend to be viewed as the best performing suppliers. The problem is these small to mid-tier operators in the Permian Basin, there's literally hundreds of them. There were some that distinguished themselves quite considerably. It could be Cactus for surface wellheads, or Rhine Energy for cementing services, or Altera for fixed cutter drill bits. Next tier, Calfrac for hydraulic fracturing with Liberty Oilfield Services, or even Extract, or for electric submersible pumps. And so it makes it really difficult. But what we do find is most commonly we do see a variance in performance from supplier to supplier. This is Baker Hughes. Some products and services they perform well in the Permian Basin. Other products and services they do not perform well in as compared to their other key competitors in the marketplace. And the same goes for Halliburton. The same goes for Schlumberger. And the same goes for Weatherford. In U.S. land, what you find is that Weatherford consistently performs below industry average. They really do not demonstrate leadership in performance, but they offset their performance shortcomings with pricing concessions to competitively position themselves down here as a discount provider. I share this information because we'll have a follow-up webinar that details more about the Permian Basin, perhaps in February. perhaps even share some of the most recent findings from our submitting services and surface wellhead reports. But as it relates to our presentation today for intervention services, be it for E-line, slickline, conveyance and tools, or coiled tubing, tractors, and stimulation, what you find oftentimes is that there is a wide variance in performance. And as an oil and gas operator, it oftentimes is difficult to identify who's delivering best value. So, our advice is to benchmark the suppliers that you do use, recognizing that for the suppliers that you don't use, that there are resources available to assist you. Feel free to reach out. We're glad to collaborate with the oil and gas operators. We appreciate your participation in our surveys. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar for Kimberlite Oilfield Research. We will be having future webinars in February and March on additional topics. If there are topics of interest that you'd like to see covered, feel free to give us an email. You can go to our website at kimberliteresearch.com and drop us a line or give us a call, and we'd be glad to assist you. Thank you so much for attending, and hope you have a great rest of the day. Bye now.